I believed every word that came out of her mouth, especially the ones whispered at night. She told me her husband died in a motorcycle accident. I lit a candle for him. Then he called me, from his living room. In Mindoro. The sand was still warm beneath our feet as we walked along the beach in Puerto Galera. Arcely held my arm tighter than usual, her fingers tracing small circles on my weathered skin. "You're the only man who ever made me feel safe, Bernard," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the waves. I stopped walking. At 69, I'd heard many things from women, but never that. Never with such conviction. "Safe from what, love?" I asked, turning to face her. The sunset painted her face in gold, and I swear I saw tears forming in her eyes. "From everything," she said. "From being alone. From wondering if tomorrow will come. From feeling like I don't matter to anyone." She pressed her palm against my chest. "With you, I feel like I'm home." My heart hammered against her hand. 3 months earlier, I'd been sitting in my dreary Manchester flat, rain pelting the windows, wondering if retirement meant waiting to die. Now I was here, holding a woman who said I saved her life. "You matter to me more than anything," I told her. "More than I ever thought possible." "I know," she said, and kissed me softly. "That's why I can finally breathe." We'd just left the bank earlier that day. I'd put down the deposit on a small house in Calapan, her hometown. 400,000 pesos. Nearly 8,000 pounds of my pension savings. "Our house," she'd called it, squeezing my hand as we signed the papers. "Where we'll grow old together." "Are you sure about this?" I'd asked the banker. Not about the money, but about whether dreams this good actually came true at my age. "When you love someone, Bernard, you invest in their future," Arcely had said, her voice so certain it silenced every doubt I had. "And our future starts now." That night in our hotel room, she lay with her head on my chest, tracing patterns on my skin with her fingertip. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she murmured. "After my husband died, I thought love was finished for me. I thought I was finished." "Tell me about him," I said, stroking her hair. I always asked, and she always answered, but never without pain crossing her face first. "June was everything to me," she said quietly. "We were married for 8 years. He was coming home from work on his motorcycle when the accident happened. Rain, slippery roads. He died instantly." Her voice cracked. "I blamed myself for months. If I hadn't called him to pick up groceries. If I'd told him to wait until morning. It wasn't your fault," I said, the same words I'd said 100 times before. "I know that now," she said, lifting her head to look at me. "Because you taught me that loving someone doesn't mean destroying yourself when they're gone. You taught me I deserve to be happy again." I kissed her forehead. "You saved me too, you know. I was just existing before you. Now I'm living." "Promise me something," she said, her eyes searching mine. "Anything. Promise me you'll never leave me. Promise me you'll never make me go through that kind of loss again." "I promise," I said without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." She smiled through fresh tears. "I love you, Bernard. More than I loved him. More than I thought I could love anyone." "I love you too," I said, and meant it more than any words I'd ever spoken. Later, as she slept in my arms, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Purpose. For 45 years I'd sorted mail, stamped letters, helped other people send messages to the ones they loved. Now, finally, I was the one being loved. I was the message someone wanted to keep. The house deposit felt like the smartest money I'd ever spent. It started with a Facebook notification in March 2020. The whole world was locked down, and I was sitting in my empty flat in Manchester, wondering if this was how I'd spend the rest of my life. Alone. Counting the raindrops on my window. The notification was from a language exchange group. Someone had replied to a comment I'd made about learning Tagalog. "Hi Bernard. I saw your post about wanting to practice Tagalog. I'm a native speaker, and I teach English online. Maybe we can help each other?" Her profile picture showed a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Arcely Santos, from Calapan City, Oriental Mindoro. I clicked through her photos. Simple life. Beach scenes. A few pictures with a young girl who looked about 12. Normal. Real. "That would be brilliant," I typed back. "I've always wanted to visit the Philippines." "Maybe someday you will," she replied. "I'd love to show you my country." Our first video call lasted 3 hours. She was patient with my terrible pronunciation, laughing when I accidentally asked for a bathroom instead of rice. "Your accent is so cute," she said. "Very proper, very British. And you sound like music," I told her, which made her blush. "You're sweet," she said. "I haven't laughed like this in a long time." "Why not?" Her face grew serious. "I lost my husband 2 years ago. Motorcycle accident. Since then, I haven't felt much like laughing." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "That must be incredibly difficult." "It is," she said softly. "Some days I wonder why I keep going, but talking to you tonight, I remembered what it feels like to smile." We talked every day after that. Morning for her, evening for me. I looked forward to those calls more than anything else in my week. She told me about her life. How she grew up poor but fought her way through college. How she met June when they were both 24. How they'd planned to have children but never got the chance. "I have no family left except my younger brother," she said one evening. "My parents died when I was in university. Jun was my whole world." "What about the girl in your photos?" I asked. "That's Maya," she said, her face lighting up. "Jun's niece. She's not mine, but I love her like she is. Her parents died in Typhoon Yolanda, so Jun and I took care of her. Now it's just me." The way she talked about Maya made my chest ache. Here was a woman who'd lost everything but still had room in her heart for a child who wasn't even hers. "You're remarkable, Arceli," I told her. "No," she said. "I'm just surviving." By May, we were talking about meeting. The Philippines had strict lockdown rules, but she said things might open up soon. "When you come here, I'll cook for you every day," she promised. "I'll show you the real Philippines, not the tourist places." "I'd like that very much," I said. "Can I tell you something?" she asked one night, her voice quieter than usual. "Of course. I think I'm falling in love with you." My heart stopped. "Are you sure? I know it sounds crazy. We've never met in person. But you make me feel alive again. You make me want to wake up tomorrow." She paused. "Is that terrible of me? To love someone so soon after losing Jun?" "It's not terrible," I said. "It's human. I was so scared to tell you," she admitted. "I thought you might think less of me." "I could never think less of you," I said. "And if it helps, I think I'm falling in love with you too." The smile that spread across her face was worth every lonely day I'd spent getting to that moment. By October 2021, travel was possible again. I flew to Manila, spent 2 weeks in quarantine, and finally met her at Ninoy Aquino Airport. She was smaller than I'd imagined, more delicate, but her smile was exactly the same as on video. When she hugged me, I felt like I'd finally come home. "You're really here," she whispered against my chest. "I'm really here," I said. We rented a small apartment in Makati. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. She cooked for me every morning, usually rice and dried fish or eggs. We'd sit on the tiny balcony, watching the chaos of Manila traffic below, planning our future. "I want to show you Mindoro soon," she said one morning, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "But first I need to sort out some paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" "Land titles," she said, looking embarrassed. "June left me some property, but the documents are all tangled up. Family disputes. You know how it is." I didn't, but I nodded anyway. "The lawyer says it'll cost about 400,000 pesos to clear everything up," she continued. "I've been trying to save, but teaching online doesn't pay much." "How much is that in pounds?" I asked. "About 8,000, she said quietly. "I know it's a lot. I wasn't asking you for money. I just wanted to explain why we can't go to Mindoro right away." "I can help," I said without thinking. Her eyes went wide. "Bernard, no, I couldn't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." I took her hand. "We're building a life together, right? Your problems are my problems." "Are you sure?" she asked, but I could see the relief in her eyes. "I'm sure." The next day, we went to the bank. I transferred 400,000 pesos into her account. She cried as she signed the receipt, telling me over and over how grateful she was. "I'll pay you back," she promised. "We're partners now," I said. "You don't pay back partners." But the receipts from the lawyer never came. When I asked about them a week later, she said they were still processing. When I asked a month later, she said there had been delays. By December, she wasn't mentioning the land titles at all. I started noticing other small things. How she'd leave the room when certain calls came in. How she'd flip her phone face down when we were watching television together. How Kuya Jun called her almost every evening. Who's Kuya Jun again? I asked one night after she'd finished a 20-minute conversation with him. My cousin, she said quickly. Jun's older brother. He's been like a father to me since Jun died. That's nice, I said. Maybe I could meet him sometime. Maybe, she said, but she was already looking at her phone again. The calls from Kuya Jun became more frequent. Sometimes she'd step outside to take them, even when it was raining. Sometimes she'd go to the bathroom with her phone, and I'd hear her whispering. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd say it was just family business. Kuya Jun worries about me, she explained. He thinks I'm rushing into things with you. He wants to make sure you're treating me well. I am treating you well, aren't I? I asked. Of course you are, she said, kissing my cheek. He's just protective. Filipino families are like that. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. Because the alternative, that something was wrong, felt impossible to consider. Not after I'd found happiness this late in life. Not after I'd finally found someone who needed me. But late at night, when she thought I was sleeping, I'd hear her typing messages on her phone. The soft clicking sounds would go on for minutes at a time. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear her crying softly in the bathroom. When I'd ask about it in the morning, she'd say she'd been thinking about Jun, about how guilty she felt for being happy with someone new. Some nights the grief just hits me, she'd explain. But it's getting better, you're helping me heal. I held her tighter those mornings, told her it was natural to grieve. That healing wasn't betrayal. I thought I was being understanding. I thought I was being the man she needed. I had no idea I was being the fool she required. In February 2022, Arcely told me she needed to go to Mindoro. Her younger brother had gotten sick, and she was the only family he had left. I'll be back in a week, she promised, kissing me goodbye at the bus station. Maybe 2 weeks at most. I could come with you, I offered. No, she said quickly. He's very traditional, very shy around foreigners. It would be better if I went alone first. Next time, I promise. She left on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, I missed her so much I could barely function. By Saturday, I'd made up my mind. I bought a ticket on the first ferry to Calapan City. It would be a surprise. We'd never talked about surprises, but I thought she'd be happy to see me. I arrived in Calapan on Sunday afternoon. The town was smaller than I'd expected, more rural. I took a tricycle to the address she'd given me months earlier, the house we'd supposedly bought together. The driver seemed confused when I gave him the street name, but eventually we found it. The house was there, exactly as she'd described it. Small, blue concrete walls, tin roof. But it was locked up tight. No lights, no movement, weeds growing in the front yard. I knocked anyway, called her name, walked around to the back. Nothing. A neighbor emerged from the house next door, an elderly woman carrying a basket of laundry. "Excuse me," I said in my broken Tagalog. "Do you know where Arcely is?" The woman looked at me with confusion, then recognition. "Arcely Santos?" she asked. "Yes." She shook her head. "She hasn't lived here in years. Maybe 5 years. The house has been empty." My legs felt weak. "Are you sure this is her address?" "I'm sure," the woman said kindly. "I've lived here 40 years. Nice girl, Arcely, but she moved away long ago. To Manila, I think." I stood there, staring at the locked house, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. We'd bought this house. I'd seen the papers. I'd transferred the money. How could it be empty for 5 years? "Are you okay?" the woman asked. Before I could answer, I heard footsteps behind me. A man's voice said, "Are you Bernard?" I turned around. He was about my height, maybe 10 years younger, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, Filipino, average-looking, normal, except for the way he was staring at me, like he'd seen a ghost. "Yes," I said. "I'm Bernard. I'm Jun," he said quietly. "Arcely's husband." The world tilted. I grabbed the neighbor's fence to keep from falling. "That's impossible," I managed to say. "Jun is dead. He died in a motorcycle accident." Jun shook his head slowly. "I've never owned a motorcycle in my life." My vision blurred. The ground beneath my feet felt like it was dissolving. "You can't be her husband," I said. "She's a widow. She told me, She cried when she told me. June reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He swiped through photos and held the screen toward me. Wedding pictures. Arcelie in white, radiant, standing next to this man. Church ceremony. Family gathered around them. The date stamp showed 2018. We've been married 6 years, June said gently. She left me 8 months ago, said she found work in Manila, but she never mentioned you until this week. This week? I whispered. She called me Tuesday. Said there was a British man asking questions. Said if he came to Mindoro, I should tell him the truth. June looked genuinely sorry for me. She said it was time to stop pretending. I couldn't breathe. Literally couldn't pull air into my lungs. The neighbor was saying something, offering me water, but I couldn't hear her properly. All I could hear was the sound of my own world crashing down. Where is she? I asked. I don't know, June said. She stopped answering my calls 3 days ago. The money, I said, more to myself than to him. The house deposit, the lawyer fees. June's expression grew sadder. What money? I showed him the bank receipts on my phone. Nearly £20,000 total. Transfers to Arcelie's account over 6 months. June stared at the figures and shook his head. She never bought this house, he said. This house belongs to her uncle. Has for 20 years. But we signed papers. I protested weakly. What kind of papers? I realized I didn't know. I'd trusted her completely. I'd signed whatever she put in front of me because I loved her. Because she'd said we were building a future together. I'm sorry, June said. I know this is hard to hear. As if someone was telling me it might rain later. Not that the woman I loved, the woman who'd said she loved me, had been lying about everything from the moment we met. Is Maya real? I asked, though I wasn't sure why it mattered anymore. Maya, her niece. June's niece. Your niece. June looked confused. I don't have a niece named Maya. I don't have any nieces. Of course he didn't. Of course Maya wasn't real either. Nothing was real. Nothing had ever been real. I sat down right there in the dirt road, put my head in my hands, and cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. 69 years old, sitting in the dust in a Philippine village, sobbing over a woman who never existed. I flew back to Manila in a daze. The apartment felt different now, like a movie set after filming had wrapped. Everything looked the same, but it was all just props. The kitchen, where she'd cooked breakfast. The balcony where we'd planned our future. The bed where she'd whispered that she loved me. I sat at the small table, where we'd eaten together every morning, and forced myself to remember every lie. Every single one. The dead husband. The motorcycle accident. The grief that made her cry in the bathroom. June was alive, had never owned a motorcycle, had never died in any accident. She'd manufactured every tear. The family land dispute. The 400,000 pesos for lawyer fees. There was no dispute, no lawyer, no fees. Just my money disappearing into her account. Maya, the orphan niece she loved like a daughter. A stock photo, most likely, or some child she'd borrowed for the story. No relation to June. No relation to anyone. Her younger brother who'd gotten sick. The reason she'd left for Mindoro. There was no sick brother. She'd left because she knew I was getting suspicious. She'd called June to warn him I might come looking. The ESL teaching job. I pulled up the website for the company she'd claimed to work for. It had been shut down for over a year. Her Facebook profile, which I'd stalked lovingly for months, admiring her simple life and kind smile. I searched for it now. Account not found. She'd deleted it, or blocked me, or maybe it had been fake from the beginning. Every video call where she'd looked sad talking about June's death. Every time she'd said she felt guilty for loving me so soon after losing her husband. Every promise about our future together. Every whispered I love you in the dark. I opened my laptop and did what I should have done 2 years ago. I reverse searched her photos. 3 of them came back as stock images from dating sites. Professional photos of a woman named Arcelie, but not my Arcelie. A different person entirely who'd probably never heard of me. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I'm sorry, Bernard, I never meant for it to go this far. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before typing back. Is any of it real? No response. Did you ever love me at all? No response. Why? Hours passed. Then, just before midnight, because I was drowning, and you were a life raft. But life rafts aren't forever. I threw the phone against the wall. For 3 days, I didn't leave the apartment. I ordered food delivery and sat on the balcony, watching the city move below me, wondering how I'd become this stupid, this blind, this pathetic. I was 69 years old. I'd worked for 45 years, saved my money, lived a responsible life. I'd raised 2 children with my ex-wife, helped them through university, walked my daughter down the aisle. I wasn't some naive kid fresh off the boat. I was supposed to know better. But loneliness, I realized, makes you stupid. Loneliness makes you ignore every red flag, excuse every inconsistency, believe every lie that sounds like love. I'd been so hungry for someone to need me that I'd swallowed every word she'd fed me, no matter how impossible it tasted. The phone calls she'd taken in private. Family business, she'd said. It was probably Jun, wondering where his wife had gone. Or maybe other men, other foreigners sending money to other sob stories. The times she'd seemed distant, distracted, probably calculating how much more she could extract before I got suspicious. The way she'd deflected when I'd suggested meeting her family. They're very traditional, she'd said, very shy around foreigners. Translation, they don't exist, or they'd tell you the truth. Even the house purchase, which had felt so romantic at the time. She'd guided me through every step, translated every document, assured me everything was legal. I'd signed papers I couldn't read, trusting her completely. The house that had been empty for 5 years. I'd been living in a fantasy, and she'd been the architect of every single detail. On the 4th day, I finally called my daughter in London. "Dad, you sound terrible," Emma said. "What's wrong?" "I've been a fool," I told her. "What happened?" I told her everything. Every lie, every lost pound, every moment of humiliation. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Dad," she said finally, "I'm so sorry. You tried to warn me," I said. "When I told you about Arcely, you said to be careful. I didn't want to be right about this," Emma said gently. "I wanted you to be happy." "I thought I was happy," I said. "Turns out I was just useful. Come home, Dad. Come back to Manchester. We'll figure this out." But I couldn't. Not yet. Because going home meant admitting it was over, and I wasn't ready for that. Not because I still had hope, that had died in Mindoro, but because I needed to understand how someone could lie so completely, so convincingly, for so long. I needed to understand how I could have loved a ghost. 2 weeks passed in silence. I'd moved to a cheaper hotel near the airport, preparing to fly back to Manchester. My flights were booked, my affairs in Manila mostly settled. The apartment lease was month to month, easily broken. The life I'd built here could be dismantled in a day. I was packing my last bag when my email chimed, new message from an account I didn't recognize. The subject line was just my name. I almost deleted it. After everything that had happened, the last thing I needed was more contact with Arcely. But something made me click it open. "Bernard, I know you probably hate me now, and you have every right to. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know that not everything was a lie. I did love you. Maybe not the way you loved me, but in my own way. You were kind to me when I needed kindness. You made me feel valuable when I felt worthless. That was real, even if nothing else was. I never wanted to hurt you this much. I told myself I could stop before it went too far. But survival makes us monsters sometimes. You'll never understand what it's like to have nothing, to see no way out except through someone else's kindness. That doesn't excuse what I did, but maybe it explains it. I hope someday you can forgive me. Not for my sake, but for yours. Don't let what I did make you bitter. Don't let it make you stop trusting people. There are good women out there who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. I'm just not one of them. Thank you for everything you gave me. I will remember your kindness even if you forget mine. Arcely." I read it 3 times. Then I closed the laptop and sat on the hotel bed, staring at nothing. She was right about one thing. I would never understand what it was like to have nothing. I'd grown up working class in Manchester, but I'd never been truly desperate. I'd never had to choose between honesty and survival. I'd never been backed into a corner so tight that lying to a lonely old man seemed like the only way out. But understanding didn't equal forgiveness. It didn't undo the damage. It didn't give me back the money or the time or the version of myself that had believed in fairy tales. She said she'd loved me, in her own way. What did that even mean? That she'd felt guilty while spending my money? That she'd genuinely enjoyed my company while planning to disappear? That some small part of her had wished the lies could become truth? Survival makes us monsters sometimes, she'd written. Maybe. But I'd survived plenty of difficult times without becoming a monster. I'd been divorced, unemployed, depressed, lonely, but I'd never looked at another person's vulnerability and decided to exploit it. The cruelest part was the ending. Don't let what I did make you bitter. As if my bitterness was the real tragedy here. As if the problem wasn't that she'd lied to me for 2 years, but that I might have the poor grace to be angry about it. There are good women out there who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. I'm just not one of them. This, at least, felt true. But it also felt meaningless. Because how would I ever trust my judgment again? How would I ever look at another woman's tears and not wonder if they were calculated? How would I ever hear "I love you" and not question the motive behind it? She'd made me doubt everything I thought I knew about people, about love, about myself. That was the real theft. Not the money. I could make more money. But the ability to believe in goodness, to trust in love, to think that at 69 I might still have something valuable to offer another human being. She'd taken that from me, and I wasn't sure I'd ever get it back. I didn't reply to the email. What was there to say? Thank you for explaining why you destroyed me. I'm glad my suffering served a purpose. I hope the money helps. Instead, I deleted it. Not because I wanted to forget. I'd never forget, but because some conversations don't deserve to continue. Some apologies don't deserve acknowledgement. Some people don't deserve the energy it takes to hate them properly. That night, I cried for the last time. Not for her, not for the money, not even for the time I'd lost. I cried for the version of myself that had walked along that beach in Puerto Galera, holding her hand, believing we were building something real together. I cried for the man who'd been so grateful to be loved that he'd ignored every warning sign. That man was gone now. And while I wasn't sure who would replace him, I knew he'd be harder to fool. Before leaving the Philippines, I took a bus to Batangas. Not to find Arcely. I was done looking for ghosts, but to find something else. Closure, maybe, or just a place to say goodbye to the man I'd been. There was a small chapel near the coast, nothing special, but it overlooked the sea and felt like the right kind of quiet. I bought a candle from the elderly woman outside and went in. The interior was simple, wooden pews worn smooth by decades of prayer, stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor. I lit the candle and set it with the others burning before a statue of the Virgin Mary. But I wasn't praying to her. I was lighting it for the man Arcely had created in her stories, June, who died in a motorcycle accident that never happened. The phantom husband she'd mourned so convincingly. I'm sorry you never existed, I whispered to the flame. I'm sorry she killed you off to make room for me. It sounds mad, probably, lighting a candle for a fictional character. But that fictional character had been the foundation of everything I'd believed about Arcely. Her grief for him had made her seem real to me, human, worthy of my protection. Without dead June, she was just another woman asking for money. After the chapel, I walked down to the beach and sat on a piece of driftwood, watching the waves roll in. I pulled out a piece of hotel stationery and started writing a letter I'd never send. Dear Arcely, or whoever you really are, I'm not writing this to hurt you or to get you to respond. I'm writing it because I need to say things I'll never get to say to your face. You were right that I'll never understand what it's like to have nothing. But you'll never understand what it's like to have everything you thought you wanted and then discover it was all pretend. You'll never know what it feels like to love someone so completely that you restructure your entire life around them only to find out that someone never existed. I gave you more than money. I gave you my trust, my hope, my vision of what the rest of my life could look like. I gave you the best parts of myself, and you fed them into a machine that was designed to consume lonely old men like me. I don't know if you're a victim or a predator or just a person doing whatever it takes to survive, maybe all three. But I know that I was a person who believed in love, and now I'm a person who questions everything. I know that I was a man who thought he still had something valuable to offer, and now I'm a man who wonders if I'm just a walking pension check to anyone who shows me kindness. You didn't just take my money, Arcely. You took my faith in my own judgment. You took my ability to believe that good things can happen to people like me. And maybe that was always the plan. Maybe that's what survival looks like when you've decided that other people's hearts are acceptable casualties. I hope you're safe. I hope you're fed. I hope you're warm and dry and never desperate again. But I also hope that someday you remember that the people you lie to are real. We have real feelings, real dreams, real lives that you damage when you decide to use us. I hope you remember that kindness isn't weakness, and trust isn't stupidity, even when it makes us easy targets. I hope you find whatever you're really looking for. And I hope it's worth what it costs both of us. Bernard. I folded the letter and dug a small hole in the sand near the water line. I buried it there and covered it with a smooth stone, not because I thought she'd ever find it, but because I needed to leave something of this experience behind before I could move forward. The waves washed higher as the tide came in, and I thought about how water has a way of wearing down even the hardest rocks. Time would do that to this pain too. It would never disappear completely, but it would lose its sharp edges, become something I could carry without bleeding. I wasn't the same man who'd arrived in the Philippines 2 years earlier, full of hope and hunger for connection. That man had been innocent in ways that now felt dangerous. But maybe losing that innocence wasn't entirely bad. Maybe learning to protect myself was a kind of wisdom, even if it came at a terrible price. I stood up, brushed the sand off my trousers, and walked back toward the road. I was going home to Manchester, but I wasn't going back to who I'd been before. I was going forward to whoever I was becoming. Someone harder, yes, but maybe also someone stronger. Someone less trusting but also less gullible. Someone who'd learned that love doesn't always mean what it claims to mean. The real widow in this story, I realized, wasn't Arcely. It was me. I was mourning the death of my own naivety, my own faith in easy answers. And like any widow, I'd have to learn how to live with the loss. I never went back to Manchester. That sounds dramatic, like something someone says in a movie before the credits roll, but the truth is more complicated. I did fly back, spent 3 months in my old flat, tried to pretend that life could return to what it had been before, but Manchester felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Everything was familiar but wrong. The rain felt different, the quiet felt heavier. Even my own reflection looked like a stranger. Emma tried to help. "Dad, you can't let one terrible experience ruin everything for you," she said over Sunday dinner at her house. "You were happy here once." "I was settling here once," I corrected her. "There's a difference." She didn't understand, and I couldn't explain it. How do you tell your daughter that losing everything you thought you wanted had somehow shown you what you actually needed? How do you explain that being betrayed had taught you more about yourself than being loved ever had? In May, I sold the flat and bought a plane ticket back to the Philippines. Not to look for Arcely, I was done being that kind of fool, but because something had called me back. Maybe it was the idea of finishing what I'd started, but on my own terms this time. I settled in Panglao, Bohol. Far from Manila, far from Mindoro, far from anywhere she might surface. I rented a small house near the beach, nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a view of the water. The kind of place where you can sit on your front step and watch the sun come up without anyone asking what you're thinking about. The locals were curious at first. Another aging foreigner looking for paradise or a young wife or whatever it is we're supposed to be looking for. But I wasn't looking for anything except space to figure out who I was now that I'd stopped being who I used to be. "You married, sir?" asked Mang Roberto, the fisherman who lived next door. "Divorced," I told him. "Long time ago." "Ah," he said, nodding knowingly. "You looking for new wife?" "No," I said. "I'm looking for peace." He laughed like that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. But he stopped asking personal questions after that. The first few months were hard. I'd wake up some mornings expecting to hear Arcely's voice from the kitchen, or I'd catch myself setting the table for 2. Grief is strange when you're mourning someone who never existed. There's no body to bury, no funeral to attend, no friends to offer sympathy. Just the slow, private work of accepting that 2 years of your life were built on sand. But slowly, something unexpected started happening. I started sleeping better. Started eating when I was hungry instead of when someone else's schedule demanded it. Started reading books I'd been meaning to read for years. Started talking to people without wondering what they wanted from me. Mang Roberto became a friend, though neither of us would have called it that. We'd sit on his porch in the evenings, sharing a bottle of beer, not saying much. Sometimes he'd tell me about his fishing trips. Sometimes I'd tell him about Manchester weather. Comfortable silences, no agenda, no performance. "You different from other foreigners," he said one evening. "How so?" "You not always talking about Philippines women, not asking me to introduce you to my daughter or my niece." He grinned. "My daughter too smart for you anyway." I laughed. "Good for her." You lonely, sir? I considered this. Sometimes. But lonely isn't the same as desperate. He nodded like this made perfect sense. The truth was, I was learning the difference between being alone and being lonely. Alone was choosing to eat dinner by myself while watching the sunset. Lonely was what I'd felt in Manchester, surrounded by familiar things but hungry for connection. Alone was peaceful. Lonely had made me vulnerable to someone like Arceli. I started volunteering at a local school, teaching English to kids who couldn't afford private tutors. Not because I was looking for purpose or redemption, but because I had time and they needed help. The children were brutally honest in the way only children can be. "Teacher Bernard, why you no have wife?" asked one of my students, a 10-year-old girl named Rose. "I did have a wife," I told her. "It didn't work out." "Why?" "Sometimes people want different things. What you want now, to teach you English so you can have better opportunities than your parents had." "That's all?" I thought about it. "That's enough." 6 months in, I realized I'd stopped checking her social media accounts. Not that they existed anymore, but I'd stopped looking for traces of her online. I'd stopped wondering where she was or who she was lying to now. I'd stopped carrying the anger like a stone in my chest. I wasn't grateful for what she'd done. I'd never be grateful for being used and discarded. But I'd stopped letting it define me. She'd taken my money and my trust, but she hadn't taken my ability to choose what came next. That had always been mine. One evening, I was sitting on my usual bench near the water when a woman about my age sat down at the other end. British accent, polite smile, reading a book about Philippine history. "Beautiful sunset," she said. "They usually are here," I replied. "First time in the Philippines?" "Third year," I said. "You?" "Just arrived last week. Still figuring things out." We chatted for maybe 20 minutes. Nothing deep, nothing romantic, just two foreigners comparing notes about adjusting to island life. When she got up to leave, she said, "I'm usually here around this time. Maybe I'll see you again." "Maybe," I said. After she left, I sat there for another hour, thinking. A year ago, a conversation like that would have sent my mind spinning. Was she interested? Should I ask her to dinner? What were her intentions? Now I just felt quiet. If I saw her again, fine. If I didn't, also fine. The desperate edge was gone. That night, I wrote in the journal I'd started keeping, not for therapy or processing, but just to remember things clearly. Today I realized I'm not the same man who got off the plane in Manila 3 years ago. That man was hungry for something he couldn't name, desperate to be needed by someone, anyone. He would have fallen for Arceli's story even if it had been less convincing, because he wanted so badly to believe that his life could still surprise him. This man is different, not bitter. I refuse to let her make me bitter, but awake. I know now that being needed isn't the same as being loved. I know that loneliness can make you stupid, but solitude can make you wise. I know that the worst thing that can happen to you isn't being alone. The worst thing is being with someone who sees you as a solution to their problems rather than a person worthy of honest affection. I'm not looking for love anymore. Not because I don't believe in it, but because I've learned the difference between love and need, between partnership and transaction. If love finds me again, it will have to be real love, the kind that sees me clearly and chooses me anyway, not because of what I can provide but because of who I am. Until then, I'm content to walk alone. It's better than walking with a ghost. The British woman, Sarah, I learned later, did come back to the bench the next evening. We talked about books, about the differences between Bohol and wherever we'd come from. Easy conversation. No hidden agenda that I could detect. No sob stories about dead husbands or family emergencies. "What brought you here?" she asked eventually. "I needed to start over," I said. "Bad divorce?" "Bad judgment," I said. And she laughed like she understood. We started meeting for coffee sometimes, comparing notes about island life, sharing books, talking about everything except our romantic histories. It felt revolutionary, this friendship without expectation. No one was performing for anyone. No one was trying to save anyone else. "You're different from most expat men here," Sarah said one afternoon. "Everyone keeps telling me that. They're usually either running from something or chasing something. You seem like you're just here." "I am just here," I said. Finally, I still think about Arceli sometimes. Not with anger anymore, but with something like curiosity. I wonder if she found whatever she was looking for. I wonder if the money I gave her changed her life in any meaningful way. I wonder if she ever thinks about me, or if I was just one transaction among many, quickly forgotten. But mostly, I don't wonder. Mostly, I wake up in my small house, make coffee, watch the fishermen head out for the day, and feel something I didn't expect to feel again: contentment. Not the desperate happiness of a man who thinks he's found his salvation, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who's learned to save himself. I'm 72 now. I teach English 3 mornings a week, read in the afternoons, have dinner with Sarah or Mang Roberto or whoever needs company. I send money to my children in England, but I don't send it to anyone else. I've learned the difference. Some evenings I sit on that bench and watch the sun disappear into the water, and I think about the man who walked along a beach in Porto Galera with a woman who whispered that he made her feel safe. That man was sincere and trusting and willing to believe in fairy tales. I don't mock him anymore. He was doing the best he could with what he knew at the time. But I'm glad he's not me anymore. This version of myself is harder to fool, harder to use, harder to break, and while that might sound like a loss, it feels like strength. I walk alone now, but I walk with my eyes open. I'm not looking for anyone to save me, and I'm not looking for anyone to save. I'm just here, in this moment, in this place, learning what it means to be enough for myself. And that, finally, feels like the truth.